Hi, I'm Michael Poff with the Carter-Jenkins Center. In 1913, Freud published Totem and Taboo, and in doing so, he sparked one of the most important debates that has occurred in the 20th century social sciences. That is to say, the debate regarding whether the Oedipus complex is universal. That debate continues to this day. The most important critique of Freud's theory in the 20th century was Bronislaw Malinowski's Sex and Repression from 1927, where Malinowski claimed that the Oedipus complex was a symptom of patriarchy, in particular, a pathological symptom of patriarchy. Well, Malinowski's thesis became the foundation of ever-recurring iterations of this idea that the Oedipus complex is caused by pathological patriarchy. This idea is wrong, I argue, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest now that the Oedipus complex is indeed universal, in spite of the fact that the old critique continues. What Malinowski got wrong was his thesis confused the difference between what causes the Oedipus complex on the one hand and what complicates its resolution on the other hand. And this same problem recurs over and over again, and it can be identified in the current literature very easily. I hope to show that what really causes the Oedipus complex is pretty much what Freud said. It has to do with two biological facts of our heritage as a species. One is the prolonged dependency of childhood that the human being experiences in their growth toward adult status. And the second is the precocious rate of our drive development. These two developmental lines, which are really referring to the ego and the id, are asynchronous, and they develop in a more and more asynchronous way over the course of human evolution, to the point that there is no other mammal on this planet that has as prolonged a dependency as human beings do, and whose rate of sexual drive development is so asynchronous compared to that ego development, that retarded ego development. So I hope this lecture is helpful in sorting through this controversy and this fallacy. Readers who are interested in the text of this presentation can follow the link to the International Journal of Controversial Discussions, the July 2020 issue of that journal. And thank you for listening, and thank you for visiting the Carter-Jenkins Center's website. Is Freud's Oedipus complex universal? It's remarkable how controversial this century-old question on Freud's individual developmental psychology remains. It was never so controversial, however, as when Freud applied Oedipal theory at the level of culture with Totem and Taboo in 1913. With this extension, Freud proposed his reconstruction of the origins of human culture out of the prehistoric primal horde following Darwin. The Oedipus complex was now not only the nucleus of all neuroses, it was the nucleus of all civilization as well. As Freud boldly put it, quote, "The beginnings of religion, moral, society, and art converge in the Oedipus complex," end quote. After A. Brill's English translation of Totem and Taboo from the original German in 1918, Freud's origin theory of the primal horde received systematic criticism from the discipline of anthropology, beginning with Kroeber's 1920 acerbic broadside, followed by Malinowski's Sex and Repression in Savage Society from 1927, the most influential critique of the 20th century. Psychoanalysts early on were influenced by Malinowski's thesis and took up the criticisms. Freud's cultural reconstruction was dismissed as simplistic, unscientific, lacking in evidence, and still mired in the discredited concepts of 19th century cultural evolutionists. The critical reaction to Freud's evolutionary speculations only increased doubts about the Oedipus complex as a universal feature of normal psychosexual development. As we'll see, critics still write as though it's uncontroversial to consider Oedipal theory as entirely wrong. Remarkably, however, this could not be further from the truth. I'll show that much of the original criticism from anthropology, including Malinowski's influential critique, has suffered under sustained scrutiny. The past century has actually brought increasing evidence that Freud was on the right track, and that much of the criticism is rested on fundamental confusions and misunderstandings that I hope to clarify. Ever new versions of Malinowski's original critique appear and continue to perpetuate what I refer to as the fallacy of pathological patriarchy. In what follows, I'll argue that this fallacy confuses the difference between what causes the Oedipus complex and what complicates its resolution. In doing so, I also hope to show that the logic and explanatory power of Freud's Oedipal formulations become clearer when their biological and evolutionary bases are kept in mind. Fundamental psychoanalytic concepts then yield their full significance in the systemic sense in which Freud had formulated them. Relevant concepts here will include libido, infantile sexuality, component instincts, ambivalence, bisexuality, ego, and drive development, Freud's etiological formula of the complemental series, and his emphasis on prolonged childhood dependency. The last concept listed above, Freud's recognition of the cultural ramifications of prolonged dependency, is particularly important for the cogency of Oedipal theory. For this reason, I'll address this at some length in the final, most important portion of my argument. There, I'll turn to the writing of Gezer Roheim, whose brilliant elucidation of this developmental observation in Freud's formulations is of enormous value. The fact of prolonged dependency is an uncontroversial feature of our developmental biology. It's a function of our species' evolutionary heritage and is, by definition, a cross-cultural universal. Critics of Oedipal theory invariably overlook the full import of this as it relates to yet another feature of human development that also tends to be ignored: the precocious rate of sexual drive development relative to ego development in humans. As with our protracted dependency, this asynchronous aspect of our development is unmatched by any other mammal. The disparity between these two major structures of human personality, the ego and the id, reaches its peak in early childhood when the individual is still wholly dependent on the primary caregivers for survival. Due largely to advances taking place in these structures, a normal set of developmental conflicts begins to coalesce, one which is characterized by triangular sexual competition and complicated by the bisexual nature of human biology. Freud called this matrix of developmental conflicts the Oedipus complex. The achievement among our proto-human ancestors of a means of resolving this Oedipus complex was in Freud's estimation as monumental an event for human evolution as it is for each person's development. Freud only became more certain over his career that this dissolution of the Oedipus complex, typically achieved around 5 or 6 years of age, recapitulates prehistoric primal events and adaptations made and preserved by some still incompletely understood mechanisms of inheritance. I'll argue that Freud's explanation of this human innovation can only be fully appreciated in the context of his etiological formula of the complemental series. This concept referred to the ubiquitous interrelation of innate and acquired environmental factors in human motivation and adaptation. Critics have tended to overlook the fact that already in Totem and Taboo, Freud's complemental series was guiding his speculation that the mechanisms of inheritance operating in these evolutionary adaptations could somehow entail an integration of both culturally acquired and genetically determined factors. By around the mid-20th century, Malinowski's Sex and Repression in Savage Society from 1927 began to crack under the pressure of much delayed re-examinations from within anthropology. The cracks only widened when the first follow-up field study to test Malinowski's conclusions was finally conducted by Powell in 1957, a full 30 years after Malinowski's original ethnography. Harris, from anthropology, would underscore the essential problem with Malinowski's thesis that was clarified by Powell's reexamination. Malinowski claimed to have discovered a non-Oedipal nuclear complex in the matrilineal society of the Trobrians. In this matrilineal complex, the core system of sentiments flowed not from the familiar mother-child-father triad of patriarchy, which Malinowski viewed as pathological, but instead from the avunculate triad of sister, sister's son, maternal uncle. Yet there was a glaring problem that Malinowski neglected to consider. His own ethnographic data, confirmed by Powell, revealed that the, quote, Trobrian child is brought up largely under the influence of the usual nuclear pairs. Mother's brother enters the picture only when the child is 7 or 8 years old, an age by which the Oedipal constellation is firmly entrenched, end quote. In subsequent decades, Malinowski's thesis has continued to weaken under sustained scrutiny. Ironically, the most powerful defense of Freudian Oedipal theory has come not from psychoanalysis, but from anthropology, namely Spiro's Oedipus and the Trobrians from 1982. A prodigious undoing of Malinowski's thesis, Spiro's defense marshaled a carefully reasoned and thoroughly documented case that the Oedipus complex was not only universal, but remained even more intense and unresolved in the matrilineal society of Trobriand Islands, the Veritas Society, for Malinowski's critique. The conclusion was compelling and unambiguous. Quote, the only appropriate response to the question, is the Oedipus complex universal, is how could it possibly not be? Spiro continued, quote, if there were a human society where mothers did not have male consorts, so that the son had no rival for the love of the mother, in such a society, the Oedipus complex, by definition, would not exist. So far as we know, however, no human society of that type exists or has ever existed. Spiro's conclusions in Oedipus and the Trobrians drew heavily from Malinowski's own landmark observations and the Powell follow-up study from 1957. It was a devastating blow to the Malinowskian thesis of a non-Oedipal nuclear complex. Arguably to this day, no decisive refutation of Spiro's analysis has been offered from anthropology. More recently, in Yes, the Primal Crime Did Take Place, a further defense of Freud's Totem and Taboo from 2010, anthropologist psychoanalyst Robert Paul reaffirmed with increasing confidence the answer he gave in his now classic paper from 1976, Did the Primal Crime Take Place? Paul concludes that, quote, Freud's idea of the primal father can without much difficulty be assimilated to the concept of the alpha male at the apex of a status hierarchy, such as that found among our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, that probably characterize the last common ancestor of the 3 African great apes and the hominin line, end quote. He also describes the favorable climate in contemporary anthropology for integrating sociocultural, biological, and psychological theory, and recommends that Freud's thesis in Totem and Taboo can, quote, serve as a basis for understanding both the foundational myths of our own culture, as well as the evolution of human society more generally, end quote. Given this brief sketch, it's reasonable to conclude that Freud's Oedipal theory, at the very least, has not been decisively invalidated by the 100 years of scrutiny it's received. The preponderance of findings from anthropology alone would suggest the opposite. It's also anomalous that Malinowski's matrilineal thesis would have been accepted within anthropology, quote, with almost no skepticism or critical inquiry for 50 years. That was Spiro. The Powell study, by the way, remained virtually invisible in anthropology until Spiro revived it in 1982. Remarkably, however, contemporary authors from both anthropology and psychoanalysis continue to repeat Malinowski's old argument as though it had been the final word and had never been subjected to damaging re-examinations. Blugre and Buey insist that the Oedipus complex, quote, is culture-specific and an essentially pathological outcome of a male-dominated, class-structured society, end quote, for example. Others assert that the complex itself doesn't actually occur. Quote, examination of the nature and origins of the Oedipus complex presented by psychoanalysts and critics suggests that as a hypothetical construct, there is little evidence to support its existence, end quote. That was Kupfersmith in 1995. We're asked here to believe that a fair examination of the Oedipus complex would suggest that no one anywhere has ever even had one. Even Malinowski's thesis, again the most important and ethnographically grounded critique of the 20th century, never went this far. On closer scrutiny, such broad dismissals as these may simply omit essential sources of evidence. The last critique failed to mention any of Spiro's writings, including Oedipus and the Trobrians, arguably, again, the most important and interdisciplinary defense in the last few decades. The author seems also unaware of the landmark Powell reassessment from 1957, Fox's Red Lamp of Incest from 1967, Paul's 1976 classic reexamination of totem and taboo from both anthropology and psychoanalysis. In other words, the examination excluded the most important sources in the scientific literature in support of Oedipal theory. Arguably, the unresolved nature of the debate is manifested today in a kind of interdisciplinary confusion of tongues. With regard to the perceived status of the Oedipus complex, authors from both disciplines can be quoted as saying either that it is universally accepted or that one should imagine it had disappeared completely. In the psychoanalytic literature addressing what Freud actually meant, or the most useful clinical application of Oedipal theory, the lack of consensus is well documented. It's an irony also that at the same time that anthropology was rediscovering and affirming Freud's Oedipal theory, within psychoanalysis it was suffering the opposite fate. The general waning of the Oedipus complex that Lold observed 40 years ago in 1979 has steadily increased to the point that the complex is now becoming effaced altogether, at least within intersubjectivist circles, according to Adler from 2010. And one of the many ironies that have characterized the response to totem and taboo, the resistances that Freud encountered from the start to his observations on infantile sexuality were actually reinforced by Malinowski's idyllic portrayal of unrepressed, savage psychosexuality among Trobriand islanders. Although the data of Malinowski's landmark ethnographic accounts actually confirmed Freud's observations on the polymorphously perverse nature of infantile sexuality, his interpretations of them came to mirror those of his teacher, C.G. Seligman, who regarded Freud's claims of Oedipal stage genital sensations and fantasies in the nuclear triangle to be a regrettable excrescence. Indications of Malinowski's reactions and difficulties with the facts of infantile sexuality appeared already in his initial agreements with Freud's views, which nevertheless revealed obvious unease and specific reservations. Quote, although, as I have said, the little boy has no thoughts, desires, or impulses toward his mother which he himself would feel belong to the category of the indecent, there can be no doubt that a young organism reacts sexually to close bodily contact with the mother. End quote. By the second edition of Sex and Repression in Savage Society in 1937, Malinowski, explicitly disturbed by his earlier intuition, went out of his way to reject it and to repeat the rejection, again lest anyone doubt his revised opinion. Quote, Since this was first written in 1921, I have changed my views on this subject. The statement that a young organism reacts sexually to close bodily contact with the mother appears to me now absurd. I'm glad I may use this strong word, having written the absurd statement myself." End quote. The urgent tone with which Malinowski appeared to protest too much in this later edition could suggest a traumatic element, après coup, or after the fact, in his response to the initial, very public acknowledgement of Oedipal sexuality. Smadja from 2011 has proposed that such a response occurred within anthropology to the confrontation with psychoanalysis following Totem and Taboo. There may be justification for this in the ironic, anomalous, and polarized quality of the reactions. Within psychoanalysis, neo-Freudians like Fromm, Horney, and Gardner were swayed by Malinowski's disavowal of Oedipal longings for the mother among Trobriand boys and sexual rivalry with the father, even in repression or displacement. From anthropology, Kroeber redoubled his earlier criticism and called for a redefined Oedipal kernel without the superego, which he viewed as one of Freud's, quote, gratuitous and really irrelevant assumptions. Fromm answered the call and argued that it was not sexuality, but the child's, quote, defeat in the fight against authority, which constitutes the kernel of the neuroses, end quote. It would become increasingly difficult to recognize anything either Oedipal or Freudian in the developing redefined neo-Freudian Oedipal kernel. Contemporary rejections of Oedipal theory often rely on parodies of Freud's basic concepts. This is common in critiques of Freud's concept of infantile sexuality. Let's return to our earlier example, where the claim was that, quote, there is little reason to believe in the existence of the Oedipus complex, end quote. The author portrays Freud as believing that infants are born with knowledge of both sexes' genitals, and that Oedipal-aged children have sexual knowledge of adult intercourse, as if they can understand what this entails. Since the author provides no context for this claim, other than a general reference to Freud's entire introductory lectures, it remains difficult to understand on what basis he arrives at it. He simply writes, without any clarification, that Freud, quote, contended that anatomical knowledge of the opposite sex, as well as a desire for sexual intercourse with the opposite sex parent, is genetically inherited. Freud's actual observations on childhood sexuality demonstrate how misleading such characterizations can be. With regard to anatomical knowledge, Freud was clear on his view that young girls and boys originally make the egocentric assumption that all genitals are like their own, that boys, for example, quote, attribute the same male genital to both sexes, end quote. In The Ego and the Id, from 1923, Freud refers to a boy's pre-Oedipal identification with the father, and then clarifies that perhaps, quote, it would be safer to say identification with the parent, for before a child has arrived at a definite knowledge of the difference between the sexes, it does not distinguish in value between its father and its mother, end quote. Freud's formulations on the castration complex, castration anxiety, and penis envy presuppose the potential anxieties children can have when first confronted with anatomical facts, so at odds with their original misconceptions based on concrete thinking and egocentrism. The following passage from 5 lectures on psychoanalysis demonstrates the complexity of Freud's actual views on infantile sexual knowledge and experience. Quote, during the time when the child is dominated by the still unrepressed nuclear complex, an important part of his intellectual activity is brought into the service of his sexual interests. Under the influence of the component instincts that are active in himself, he arrives at a number of infantile sexual theories, such as attributing a male genital organ to both sexes alike, or supposing that babies are conceived by eating and born through the end of the bowel, or regarding sexual intercourse as a hostile act, a kind of violent subjugation. But as a result precisely of the incompleteness of his sexual constitution, if he's a boy, and of the gap in his knowledge due to the hidden nature of the female sexual channel, the young investigator is obliged to abandon his work as a failure." End quote. Condensed into this passage are a number of essential concepts and empirical observations that remain as useful today as they were when Freud formulated them over a century ago. Childhood sexuality and infantile sexual theories are described here in relation to their specific stage-typical aggressive trends, and in the context of Freud's concept of the libidinal component instincts. The latter concept pertains to the building blocks of psychosexual development and is not limited to the leading oral, anal, and genital zones most people are familiar with. It comprises every somatic source of sensory excitation, each of which is associated with functions basic to human survival. Freud's psychosexual synthesis operationalized the question of how libidinal components emerge, compete for dominance, and eventually become more or less successfully coordinated in the service of mature object relations, conscience formation, and reproductive genital primacy. The libido concept applied to the entire sensory field, and did so in the context of a model that accounted for the vicissitudes of drive components over the entire life course. Critics often overlook the fact that Oedipal sexuality must not be, quote, reduced to the genital precisely because of the importance Freud accords to infantile sexuality and the partial drives, end quote. That was from Chasowitz, Smergel, and Grunberger, 1986. Freud's epigenetic model of the gradual differentiation and integration of drive components in the course of ontogeny is a reminder that references to the concept of infantile genital make no sense apart from the systematic interrelation of all component drive contributions, including pregenital or pre-Oedipal ones. Otherwise, the Oedipus complex is inevitably misunderstood and reduced to intensifying genital sensations and fantasies. But this would be an oversimplification of Freud's view, as demonstrated in the passage just quoted above. The typical sexual theories of childhood are no less Oedipal because of their conspicuous pre-Oedipal oral, anal, and other components. Rather, these components, along with the child's maturing ego functions, are now enlisted on behalf of emerging Oedipal trends. In Freud's words, they are brought into the service of the child's infantile genital aims. The meanings associated with Oedipal or infantile genital are easily confused or confounded with those of adult genital primacy. Malinowski, for example, regarded the denial of conscious sexual fantasies on the part of Trobriand men for their actual aging mothers as a disproof of the Oedipus complex. Such a misunderstanding may have played a role in Malinowski's conflicted reaction to the facts of Oedipal sexuality identified above. This confusion denies the persistence of unconscious wishes from childhood and eliminates the essential distinction in Freudian theory between fixated points in development and between external reality and psychic reality. There is a world of difference between the genital experiences at these different levels of maturation and development. It must be held in mind that Oedipal sexuality remains fully infantile in every specific Freudian sense of this term. Consolidation of masculine and feminine identifications remains incomplete. Representations of sexual anatomy are not yet integrated into a mature self-concept that is consistent with genital primacy and sexual reproductive capacity. The full implications of sexual intercourse and reproduction are not yet comprehensible to the Oedipal child, nor do their real consequences yet apply. Pre-Oedipal oral and anal trends still vie for dominance over genital ones. Boundaries defining self-object representations are still fluid and easily fragmented. Thinking is still largely egocentric, concrete, and dominated by impulse, magical thinking, and fantasy, rather than the reality principle. And finally, full physical maturation, along with emotional independence from caregivers, could still be as much as 2 decades away. For all such reasons, vaguely defined critiques of Freud's views on infantile sexuality, using phrases with highly charged adult connotations like, quote, the desire for sexual intercourse with the opposite sex parent, end quote, will always be misleading unless they specify the meaning of these concepts in their particular and proper developmental contexts.